Today I'd like to tell you a little bit about St. Anthony. Now, if you ever are looking at statues of the various saints, St. Anthony can be recognized in one of two ways. First of all, he is was a Franciscan, so he's wearing a brown robe, with a white rope or cincture around his waist, and he has a tonsure, meaning he's bald on top. But the distinguishing characteristics are he might be holding a child Jesus. That tradition came from the world of art. He was often pictured with a book that had a picture of Jesus in it. And as the years, the decades, the centuries went by, the picture of Jesus grew to be larger and larger, and artists started making the book smaller and smaller until finally they got rid of the book completely and he was just holding Jesus. But that's one way to recognize him. He's a Franciscan who's holding Jesus. The other way is he's a Franciscan with the brown robe and the cincture, but he also has a fish somewhere on his statue. The reason for that is because once he was at a town where he was not very well received, and so he went down to the shore and began to speak. He began to speak to God, and he began to speak to the angels, and he was giving this sermon, and it was noticed that the heads of the fish were coming up out of the water so the fish could hear him well. And the people of the town saw that and said, maybe we should listen to Anthony too. So there can be a fish on a St. Anthony statue. Now, whether that story really happened, I don't know, but it is a nice legend, and it points to the fact that he was the greatest preacher of his age. So, St. Anthony was born outside of Lisbon, Portugal in the year 1195. He was born into some wealth, but what was most important about his childhood was he was not only very pious, so he prayed a lot, but he was also very well educated. His family spared no expense on giving him a good education. Well, he decided to devote his life to the Lord, so he became a monk. Somebody who would be in a monastery praying all day. When he was in the monastery, he was made the guest master, which meant if somebody came to visit the monastery, he was the one who was in charge of hospitality. He was the one who was in charge of making sure that their needs were met, they were welcomed, and all the rest. And one day, he welcomed a small group of Franciscan friars. Now, just immediately prior to that, St. Francis of Assisi, one of the greatest saints ever, founded the order of St. Francis. He and a band of followers lived a life that was to be marked by evangelical poverty, dedication to carrying out the Lord's will, and they were becoming a force within the church, providing a good example for people, being good servants to the people of God, and providing witness to the fact that life could be simpler, more holy. And so they took a vow of poverty, and they always strived to live that vow of poverty well. And so anyway, when Anthony met them, he was impressed. He was impressed with the austerity with which they lived. They had no possessions. Their lives were simple. Their lives were focused on their holy work and focused on carrying out the Lord's will. So anyway, he was immensely impressed by them. Secondly, through the town in which his monastery was came a procession. There were some Franciscans who had gone to North Africa to preach to the Muslims, and those Franciscans were martyred. The King of Portugal had paid to have their remains brought back home, and so as they were going to the place where they were to be buried, Anthony was inspired by the faith that would lead somebody to go to a very hostile place, a very hostile environment, and preach the faith. And so he decided that he was going to leave his monastery and become a Franciscan, a friar, a follower of St. Francis. And that's exactly what he did, because he wanted to be a missionary. He wanted to lead that simple life. He wanted to live the life of evangelical poverty well, and that's what he was going to do. And so off he went. He became a friar, and then received permission to go to North Africa, there to preach to the Muslims. The problem was, he was not well. He became terribly ill and had to come back home. So they put him on a ship to sail back to Portugal. The problem there was the ship ran into a storm, was blown wildly off course, and he ended up in Italy. And he was really too sick to be moved. So they put him in a small hermitage, and there he was supposed to pray and recover. He was with some other friars, and his life was rather quiet there. One day, his life changed. There was to be an ordination, and some Dominicans, they're known as the Order of Preachers, they were coming to the ordination, and the Franciscan friars were coming to the ordination. Everybody thought the other group was going to be preaching that day, and so nobody was ready. And so the question is, well, who should preach? And the prior, for some reason, picked Anthony and said, Anthony, why don't you give the sermon? And so he did. And everybody was awestruck at the depth and breadth of his knowledge, at his eloquence, and his understanding of the life and mysteries, or the life of Jesus and the mysteries of the faith. He so impressed everybody that, well, his life changed. He was immediately known for being a great preacher, and not just a great preacher, but somebody who really had a wonderful depth and breadth of knowledge of the Catholic faith. And St. Francis himself was impressed. Francis always had this idea that his followers were meant to be very simple men. They were supposed to lead that life of evangelical poverty, and their focus was to be rather narrow. But because of that, he didn't think that they should pursue an education because it wasn't what they were about. Well, Anthony changed his mind. Anthony made Francis understand that the more we know, the more we can explain, the more we can understand, the more we can appreciate, the more we can help others to come to know Jesus Christ. Not just the more we know about the faith, but the more we know about the world. And so Anthony changed the mind of St. Francis. And Francis was so impressed that he had Anthony teach the new novices year after year after year. Well, in addition to that, it was a time of great theological controversy in Europe. There were heresies galore, people who were well-intentioned, but people who had terrible misunderstandings about the Catholic faith, or about the nature of God, or about the nature of reality. And those heresies, those misunderstandings, those errant teachings needed to be combated. And so they sent out preachers, and the greatest preacher they had, of course, was Anthony. So he spent the rest of his life not just teaching, but going around from town to town, preaching wherever he was needed, preaching to whoever who would listen, strengthening the faith of those who were shaky and returning the faith of those who had left. He was somebody who, through his great eloquence and through his great understanding, through his depth of knowledge, led many people to the faith. And so he became really the finder of lost souls. Now, his life was short. As I said, he was born in 1195 and died in the year 1231, so he didn't live very long. But his sermons were so wonderful that people wrote them down. They said they could remember them decades later because they made such great sense. And so he became a doctor of the church because he taught so well. Now, what do we know St. Anthony for? Well, he's the finder of lost things. Apparently, when he was a novice master and a teacher to those young Franciscans, there was a young man who left. Now, Anthony had a book, and it was a book of the Psalms, and he loved the book. In those days, there was no printing press yet, so books were valuable, and it was easily his most valuable possession. Not only did he love the book, but he had his notes written in it about all sorts of questions of the faith. Well, when that young man left, he stole Anthony's book, and off he went, and it disappeared. And Anthony prayed, and he prayed, and he prayed that maybe his book could be returned. And lo and behold, one day the young man came back with Anthony's book, and not only did he return the possession and apologized for taking it in the first place, but he came back to the Franciscans and he became a good friar himself. And so that's how St. Anthony became the finder of lost things. What we need to understand is that's a nice old tradition that, people pray to St. Anthony when they have lost something. But really what we should understand are really those two important aspects of his life. First, that you never know where you're going to end up. His hope was to be a missionary. His hope was to go preach to the Muslims in North Africa. It didn't work out, and I'm sure he was terribly disappointed. But God had a plan for him. He got to preach to the people of Europe who needed to hear his wisdom, who needed to see his faith in action, who needed to be inspired by his wonderful words. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the gift of an education. Sometimes we forget how important that is. It always impresses me that St. Francis had his eyes opened by St. Anthony. See, St. Francis, if you think about who are the greatest saints in the history of our faith, I'd say the Blessed Mother should be first. But after the Blessed Mother, St. Paul, St. Francis, they're probably right up there. And so anyway, you don't generally think that some great saint is going to have a change of mind in the middle of leading the holy life that he's called to. But St. Francis did, because he met somebody who was well educated. He met somebody who knew so much. He met somebody who could explain so many things. And that great education was put into the service of preaching the good news. So what we all need to do is make sure that we never stop learning. We never stop reading. We never stop speaking to people. We never stop trying to understand our faith better. And we never stop trying to explain or to understand the world around us more and more deeply. Because the more things we can appreciate, the more things we can understand, the more connections we could draw, the better we will be at being the good evangelists, the good preachers of the faith we're all called to be. That's not just for priests, it's for each and every one of us. We need to be people who are experts in what we believe, what we've experienced, and so many other things as well. And doing so, we'll be faithful witnesses to the gospel.